My name is Kelly Greenlee. I am the Community Outreach Librarian at Prince Memorial Library, and we're very happy to have you here this evening for our Camden Conference learning event. Um, tonight's learning event is the rise of right-wing populism in Europe, and we are joined by Andrea Stanley Hester and Pam Barry, who is from the Camden Conference. So every year, libraries across Maine partner with Camden Conference to round out the learning experience uh, on a global topic of conversation. This year's learning event is the result of a partnership. Um, sorry, I should say tonight's learning event is the result of a partnership with Camden Conference, but also with two other libraries. So my library is Prince Memorial Library. I am joined by Scarborough Public Library and Falmouth Memorial Library. So if you are coming from those libraries, welcome. We're very happy to have you. The theme for this year's Camden Conference is Democracy Under Threat, a Global Perspective. And I'm going to pass the baton to Pam Barry, who is going to say a few words about this year's Camden Conference. Pam?
Thank you, Kelly. Hi, my name is Pam Barry, and on behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you. And I'd also like to give a big thanks to the Cumberland Library, Prince Memorial Library. They have been working with us for a while now and are always kind of go above and beyond what we expect in terms of organizing programs. So again, thank you to Kelly and to the Prince Memorial Library. The Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. In keeping with our mission, we offer a series of community events leading up to our annual weekend conference. These events are intended to provide background on the yearly topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in the three-day format. As we've been told, the topic for this year is, and this is the 38th Camden Conference, and the topic is Democracy Under Threat, a global perspective. This will take place February 21 to 23, live at the Camden Opera House and streamed at Rockland and Falmouth. For more information on organization and the 2025 conference, see camdenconference.org. And once again, I'd like to thank the Prince Memorial Library, and particularly Kelly, for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam.
Okay.
So I want to spend a little time focusing on how tonight's format is going to work. Andrea has a presentation that she's going to give. We do welcome questions. I think she's going to try and handle the questions at the end. If you have a question that you would like to ask, there are two ways to do that. So down at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button, chat icon. So you can click on that chat icon. That's going to send a chat to me and not to the entire group. So if you have a question and you'd like to prefer to put it in the chat, you can do that. Or if you'd like to ask it with your voice, you can do that as well, but I'd like you to do it by raising your hand. So if you go to your the bottom of your screen, and you're gonna see, if you hover your mouse, you're gonna see at the bottom, you're gonna see reactions. So if you click on that little reactions button, you're going to get the option to raise your hand. So if you raise your hand, and I will call on you, and it will all work like magic. I love that. So let me also do a little bit slightly more housekeeping. I just want to remind people that who are listening tonight and participating in tonight's event that we are in particularly contentious times, and that some of us are feeling a little bit tense as a result. For our purposes tonight, I just want to remind everyone that not everybody leans the same way politically, and that we're going to keep tonight's conversation on topic and civil. Without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. Andrea Stanley Hester is the immediate past co-president of the World Affairs Council of Maine and former president of the Harvard Club in Maine. She is currently an instructor at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Southern Maine, where she teaches classes in European history and political science. She has a bachelor's degree in history from Tufts University and a master's degree in government from Harvard Extension School. She lives in our neighboring town, North Yarmouth, with her husband, youngest daughter, and 2 cats. Andrea, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really appreciate it. And thank you too, Pam.
Sure.
And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. You never know with a topic like this, whether or not anyone's going to actually be interested to hear what you have to say on it. So I'm very happy that you're all joining me here tonight. So what I will do is I'm going to talk first about, how do we define populism? Because I think sometimes people hear that word and it's one of those isms that you hear, but you don't actually know what it means. So I'm going to just talk briefly about how we define populism, the difference between left and right-wing populism. Then I'll give a quick overview of the situation in Europe and Western Europe mostly. And then I'll end up by talking about, why do many Europeans support populist parties? What's the big attraction? Okay, so to start off, how do we define populism? Professor Cas Mude is a Dutch professor of political science at the University of Georgia, and he's a widely respected expert on populism. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. Aha. Can you see this? Yes?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Let me just start the slideshow here. Great. Okay. He defines populism this way. He says, populism is an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into 2 homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. So basically what you have is a corrupt elite and the pure people. The people and the elite, who the people are and who the elites are, differs from group to group. But the people, who are determined by their common values, are, to the populace, the only legitimate group. They are the pure people. And I'll give you a quick example here. This is a right-wing populist in France. Her name is Marine Le Pen, and she ran for president a couple of times. And during one of her presidential campaigns, her tagline for her campaign was "Au nom du peuple," in the name of the people. Okay, and who she means by the people is very specific. It's not everyone in the country. So we'll look at that a little more closely. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism. Left-wing populism is almost always focused on economic issues. So we see here 2 pictures. In the upper left-hand corner is a Spanish left-wing populist group called Podemos, which means we can. And the sign that he's holding up says, "Let's help the poor, no to markets." And the other picture is actually in the United States. I picked that one because the signs were in English and it was just sort of easier to understand. This is the Occupy Wall Street, which was a left-wing populist-based movement. Like I said, left-wing populism is almost always focused on economic issues. Here in the United States, you could think also of Senator Bernie Sanders when he talks about the 99% versus the billionaire class, okay? The 99% are the good, pure people, and the billionaire class are the corrupt elite. Right-wing populism adds a third group. You still have the dynamic of the people versus the corrupt elites, often working class people versus the elites, which are, the elites can be people like, you know, the establishment, what we sometimes call here the deep state, also referred to sometimes as coastal elites, or the mainstream or lamestream media. Academics are often considered part of the elite, of course, otherwise known as pointy-headed intellectuals who think they're better than everyone else and tell people what to do. So those are generally the groups that are often considered the elites. But the right-wing populists add a third group, which is the out-groups. The out-groups are people that they say the elites are coddling, and they're putting their needs and their wants ahead of the good and pure people. So in Europe, who are some of the outgroups that these right-wing populists are talking about? Examples would include, of course, immigrants, Muslims, sometimes LGBTQ people. In Europe, you have historically the Roma and Sinti people, sometimes known as gypsies, though we don't use that term anymore. They prefer the term Roma. And then, of course, historically speaking, Jewish people have been considered an outgroup by many right-wing populist groups. They think that the elites cave to these outgroups, giving them special privileges and allowing them to cut in line ahead of them for, say, housing or benefits. And the people are left to pay the bill. They're getting a raw deal. So they basically are saying that the elites help the outgroup, cut in line, or take away the benefits from the good and pure people who have worked very hard and for many years, and they've earned everything they've had to, that they've had. But these other people come in and just are given all these things that they haven't earned. Now, there's also a difference between populism in the United States and European populism that I should point out, which is that populist parties are much more common in Europe because European countries in general have a multi-party electoral systems, which supports smaller parties. And the larger parties in European countries are generally not so monolithic as they are in the United States. Many small parties will flourish even with smaller numbers. But in the United States, for example, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders had to work through the main political parties when they wanted to run for president. Bernie is usually an independent, but he ran for president through the Democratic Party. And Donald Trump was, I think it was a Democrat a long time ago, was a member of the Reform Party for a while. But then when he ran for president, did it through the Republican Party. So now let's just take a general overview of right-wing parties across Europe and what's the current situation. 5 years ago, populist parties held power in only 2 countries in the European Union, in Hungary and Poland. Now they have a share of power in 8, in Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Sweden, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic. And you see from this map here, slightly dated, I couldn't find a more update to one, but this gives you a general idea of European countries where, and EU members where far-right parties are in the top 3 political parties in the country. And there's a lot of blue there. So those are a lot of countries where the extreme party is right up toward the top of political leadership in their country. Now, and then the yellow, it says EU members holding elections this fall. This is actually from 2023. So like I said, slightly dated. Poland had an election, and the right-wing party that was in power there for many years lost to a moderate centrist. So that's some good news there. Okay. So now I'd like to give you just an overview. So that just sort of shows you how many countries in Europe have right-wing parties. I mean, it's a substantial number that we're talking about who are in the top 3 in their countries. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. I can't do all of them. There isn't enough time to look at each of them, but I'm going to look at a few just to give you a sort of an overview and a taste of what's going on in each of these countries. In Italy, we have Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She's the leader of the Brothers of Italy party. You can see behind her, it says Fratelli d'Italia. That name comes from the opening words of the Italian national anthem. It is currently the leading right-wing populist party in Italy. There are actually several of them. You can see the tricolor flame it uses, which interestingly is based on the logo of the Italian social movement, or Movimento Sociale Italiano, the MSI right there. So that round flame icon that says MSI was for a party formed after World War II by the supporters of Benito Mussolini and his fascist party. So the Brothers of Italy, you see, has a very similar flame. Not necessarily a coincidence. The Brothers of Italy is strongly anti-immigrant. And in fact, Giorgia Meloni actually went so far as to call for a naval blockade of immigrants coming over from the Middle East and Europe and Africa. It didn't end up happening, but the fact that they, called for something so strong, and outrageous was very notable. The party is also well known to be anti-LGBTQ, anti-abortion, pro-traditional family. Meloni describes herself as a woman, a mother, and a Christian whose mission is, quote, to defend God, country, and family, very traditional values that appeal to the far right. However she chooses to describe herself, she is clearly the most right-wing Italian leader since Benito Mussolini. Next up, we have the Netherlands and right-wing populist leader Geert Wilders. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's the leader of the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands and is, among other things, a notorious Islamophobe. We see here the picture of him. He's holding a sticker that says in Arabic, Islam is a lie, Muhammad is a, I won't say it, but it starts with the letter B. And the Quran is poison. Muslims here, clearly, are the most significant outgroup for the Dutch right-wing populist party. Because of stunts like this, actually, Geert Wilders has 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week protection due to constant threats on his life. And below is a Party for Freedom, members of the Party for Freedom, and the banner says, Islam hurts your freedom. The party advocates for a general ban on asylum, a referendum on EU membership, and a reevaluation of environmental restrictions. It used to be considered a fringe group, but it is now a part of the mainstream of Dutch politics. It won a huge victory last year when it came in first in the general election, which was a great shock to many people inside and outside of the Netherlands. It still needed coalition partners, however, in many European governments. If you don't win a majority over 50%, you have to form a coalition government with other parties. And so they came out first in the election, but they didn't win enough to rule by themselves. They had to, try to form a coalition. And Wilders, nobody wanted to work with Geert Wilders. So he really desperately wanted to become prime minister, but he had to agree not to try to become prime minister in order for the other parties to agree to form a coalition government with his party. And this often happens in Europe when other parties will band together to exclude the right-wing populist party from power. Next up, we have France. Marine Le Pen is the former longtime leader of the National Rally, and Jordan Bardella is the current leader. Le Pen has run for president twice and lost both times, but the National Rally has gained significantly in popularity over the years, and currently it's over 30%, mostly in rural areas and the industrial Northeast, the poorer, more rural areas of France. Her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, founded the party, which was originally called the National Front. So many people know it by that name as well. He's a very controversial figure, known to be an anti-Semite. He infamously said that the Holocaust was, quote, just a detail of history. Marine took over leadership of the party from her father in 2011 and actually threw him out of the party in order to clean up the party's image with voters, what she called dédiabolisation, or de-demonization of the party. She's the one who changed the party's name from National Front to National Rally in an effort to make it seem more mainstream and less extremist. She changed like I said, the party was very anti-Semitic, but she has focused much more on Muslims than on Jewish people. So the new outgroup for the National Rally are the many Muslim migrants who have come to France. And it's really quite strange because she's actually attended rallies against anti-Semitism. But there's still a current, I think, of anti-Semitism in the party. It still attracts that type of person, but she's made a lot of efforts to try to push that to the side. And her efforts seem to have borne fruit, as the party has never been more popular than it is today. Like I said, over 30%. She stepped down from leadership of the party in 2022 in favor of the charismatic Bardella, young, good-looking, very well-spoken, very, very good with social media. She rightly believed that he would bring in more young voters to the party, and that's exactly what he has been able to do. Germany, for many years, right-wing populist parties in Germany were marginalized, even more so than in other countries, because of Germany's unique history and its subsequent strict laws forbidding Nazi symbolism in speech. But this generally agreed upon restriction is slowly eroding. In fact, the far-right populist party in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, as it's commonly referred to, is nowadays viewed positively by almost 20% of Germans, which is a huge, very significant number. And it recently won a regional election in the eastern state of Thuringia, which was a first for a far-right party. The first time a far-right party won a state election in Germany since the Nazi era. And it came very close to winning a second state election. It is now the second most popular party after the center-right party, the CDU, Christian Democratic Union, and it's more popular than the center-left party in Germany right now. And the banner below says, "Our Land First." This is an AfD rally. And I just want to show you a couple more of their posters to give you a flavor of what they are about. The one on the top says Germany, but normal. Vote for the AfD. And the one below says, New Germans, we'll make them ourselves. And it says, you dare to do, you dare, Germany, like you dare to vote for us. Okay. By the way, I should mention that if you're interested in learning more about right-wing populism in Germany, there is an upcoming Camden Conference talk that may be of interest to you. Professor Jennifer Yoder, that's Y-O-D-E-R, of Colby College, will be giving a Camden Conference library talk titled "The Far Right in Germany, How Serious a Threat to Stability." And that will be on December 9th at 6 p.m. at the Lithgow Public Library in Augusta. And I believe that's in person only. But you can go to the Camden Conference website, look under events and see it listed there if you didn't quite catch what I was saying. But that should be very interesting. She's going to talk, I think, about the AfD for her whole talk. So, okay. So when you look at populist parties in Europe, you look at each country's domestic political situation. But for the 27 European countries that are in the European Union, you also need to look at their right-wing populist representation in the European Parliament, which is the one EU institution whose members are directly elected by EU citizens and whose composition can tell us important things about the strength of right-wing populism. So briefly, I promise, because I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of European Union bureaucracy. The European Parliament is the lawmaking body or the legislature of the European Union. It has 720 members from various EU countries, and elections are held every 5 years. The last one was held in early June. And this is shows you the results of that election. So within the European Parliament, members of similar political sympathies form different groups. The largest is the center-right European People's Party. You can see here EPP, the sort of dark blue EPP. That's the center-right party. To the right of them are two different right-wing groups, the European Conservatives and Reformists, ECR, and the Identity and Democracy, our ID group, which actually, even since June, has, I think, sort of been taken over by a new right-wing group led by Viktor Orban. It's called, I think it's called Patriots for Europe. And it's a new group. It's almost like a MAGA version of right-wing populists in the European Parliament, Patriots for Europe, but it's not on this particular chart because it's a relatively recent thing that has happened. But you can see after the election in June, these right-wing groups control 131 seats in the chamber. And if they were to combine, which they have not done, they would be the second largest group in the parliament after the center-right EPP. So why don't these two extreme right-wing groups join forces? Mostly because there's a lot of bickering and competition between them, which keeps them from uniting. But they are definitely very instrumental in pushing EU policy toward the right. And as you look at this map, remember that each of these dots represents a member of the European Parliament. They're called MEPs. And each of these groups, these ideological groups you see here, have members from all different countries. So each group has members from France, from Germany, from Italy, from all of the 27 different countries. And you'll notice that the ones on the left have lost members, and the S&D, which is the center left grouping, didn't gain or lose any. And the centrist party called Renew lost 22 members. Non-aligned saw a huge gain in the biggest of all of them. But it's generally speaking the right side parties that have had the most success in the latest election. So as you can see, the right-wing populist parties are slowly but surely moving from the fringes to the mainstream of European political life. But why? Why do people support the far right? What's the big attraction? So there, in my view, there are three broad reasons why people support right-wing populists: economic instability, cultural change, and security fears. And I'll go through each of these one by one. I put the three-legged stool there because that's how I think of it in my head, the sort of three-legged stool of right-wing populism. So the first one is economic instability. And there have been three major drivers of economic stability on a macro level in Europe in recent years. The first one is the Eurozone debt crisis, which began around 2009 on the heels of the Great Recession of 2007, which was the most severe global economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression. In Europe, Greece, Italy, and Ireland, as you can see here, among other countries, were unable to repay or refinance their debts, leading to the collapse of a number of domestic financial institutions. And so the severely indebted countries looked for bailouts from other EU countries, principally Germany, and transnational banking institutions like the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, among others. They eventually received bailout funds in exchange for cuts in public spending and the introduction of austerity measures, which were painful and controversial. So this was one of the big seismic economic things that happened that got people sort of feeling insecure, economically insecure in Europe. Second one, of course, was the COVID pandemic, which dealt a severe blow to European economies in March of 2020. Europe was, after China, the hardest hit area in the world. As we ourselves are all too aware, it put the brakes on employment, businesses, travel, the supply chain, consumer spending, pretty much everything. Even more than the Eurozone crisis, the pandemic was a deeply unsettling and unnerving experience for people. And the third major shift on the macro level in Europe was the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. The war in Ukraine has taken a big economic toll on European countries, primarily because many of them have for many years been dependent on Russian oil and gas. They've had to look for alternatives that are usually much more expensive. At the same time, many European governments are sending money and weapons to Ukraine, putting additional strain on national budgets. So we can see that there's been a great deal of economic instability in Europe over the past couple of decades. And that's, again, just the macro view. On a micro view, in people's everyday lives, people also suffer economically for any range of domestic or personal reasons. Cost of living increases, high taxes, unemployment, things that affect people's everyday lives. And right-wing parties are very good at picking up on this type of thing and trying to pick at that scab and make people feel even more insecure, so that they will see that these parties are strong. They will give them a simple answer, right? So, for example, again with the German right-wing party, the AfD, this is a sign that says your pension money went to illegal immigrants. So you can see here this elderly couple wistfully looking out the window, thinking about all the money they should have had in their pension and that they will no longer have because of immigrants. All of this together has made people uneasy and unsettled. People are hurting economically, but they don't think that the powers that be, the elites, care or are listening to them. Next is cultural change. Since the 1960s and 70s, Western culture has expanded from more traditional values of faith, family, good jobs, toward increasingly liberal values, which include gender and racial equality, LGBTQ rights, acceptance of more diverse lifestyles, other religions and different cultures and languages, the sort of globalization of culture. For many people, these have been positive and welcome changes, but there has been a backlash against this shift by some people, often, not always, but often less educated, less well-traveled, older people who just aren't as open to or understanding of change. People who feel that their privileged role in society is being undermined by the elites, who again are helping the outgroups at the people's expense. In a way, they have a sense of what they call violated ownership and are more open to groups that prey on these fears. In both Europe and, of course, the United States, immigration is a central issue. In the United States, we talk a lot about the crisis at the southern border. In Europe, the overriding issue is migrants from the Middle East and North Africa. Because of conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places in the Middle East, as well as Africa, and even some parts of Asia, about 1 million people flooded into Europe between 2015 and 2016 alone, either on dangerously overloaded rickety boats or overland through southeastern Europe. Most of them were Muslim. It was Europe's biggest refugee crisis since World War II. And here is just so you can get an idea of where people were coming from and where they were going to. And you'll see on this map, it mentions the Schengen area. The Schengen area is an area of the European Union. It doesn't include all of it, but most of it, where you have free and uninhibited travel. There aren't any borders, there aren't any checks, you don't need a passport. You can live and work in any of these countries. So once you get into Greece or into Italy, say, as a migrant, you can then go all the way to Spain, you can go all the way up to Finland without any restriction of movement. And so that's what people did. They when they came in through, and if they made it to Italy and Greece or over through, Romania, Bulgaria, and into Hungary through there, they would go many different places. Many people, again, were sympathetic to the migrants' plight and tried to help them. Angela Merkel, who was the Chancellor of Germany at the time, famously stated, "Wir schaffen das. We can do this." She committed to opening Germany up to the asylum seekers and giving them food, shelter, and aid, and she encouraged other European countries to do the same. Supporters lauded her humanitarian gesture, while opponents said it would open the door to economic hardship, cultural clashes, and security issues. There was a significant backlash from those people who were overwhelmed by this rush of strange new people who were so different in so many ways and who were dependent on their new hosts for food, shelter, money. Some people resented the attention and financial help they were receiving. And here you see on the left-hand side, there were many people who were welcoming when migrants came into Germany. You see the signs there. They will sometimes put them in English because for one reason, if it's a public protest or something, they know the media is covering it. They will sometimes put signs in German and English, but also because I think because many of the migrants might have been more likely to be able to read English than to be able to read German at that time. So two welcoming signs from people on the left, but on the right, a different kind of sign. That's a picture of Angela Merkel, who, like I said, was chancellor at the time. And it's a very dark, unflattering picture of her. She's clothed in what looks like Muslim garb. And it says, "Mrs. Merkel, here are the people. Here is das Volk. We are the people. We're the people you should be paying attention to, not these other people." And das Volk, the people, which reminds me of, again, Marine Le Pen, au nom du peuple, the people. Merkel paid for this humanitarian gesture, by the way, when her center-right party was significantly weakened and ultimately ended up supporting stricter immigration measures once she was gone. And the third area that I want to mention is security fears. And this dovetails very closely with cultural change. In many ways, it's a subset. When people feel physically unsafe, populist leaders deliberately stoke people's fears and tell them that they, the leader, are the only one who cares and the only one who can protect them. You may recall the Islamist terrorist attacks that took place in Paris in 2015, in which 130 people died. Marine Le Pen told supporters during a rally that it was the result of, quote, government inaction, lies, and above all, its crazy, undiscerning immigration policy. According to her, the, at the time, National Front was the only party able or willing to do what was necessary to protect the real French people. She said, quote, I will protect you. My first measure as president will be to reinstate France's borders, she said at an election rally. This promise elicited wild applause and cheers from the crowd, prompting the party's traditional chant, "This is our home." And just to remind you, here's an overview of some of the major terrorist attacks. There was a wave of them between 2004 and 2017. Pretty large scale attacks. All of them were by Islamist extremists, with the exception of the third one down, the bombing and shooting in Norway in 2011 was by a lone wolf right-wing extremist. So this was a period of time when right-wing populist leaders saw big surges in membership as people felt physically vulnerable and unsettled. And even though there haven't been huge attacks like this lately, people remember them well, and it still affects them psychologically. But it's not just terror attacks that people are concerned about. Right-wing groups are constantly harping on the idea that immigrants are somehow inherently prone to criminality, that they're just looking for an opportunity to commit any number of crimes. One of the crimes they generally focus on is sexual assault. Here is an example of AFD election posters playing directly on this fear. So the slide on the left-hand side says, more security for our wives and daughters. If you look at the picture, very menacing in the background. These obviously, men who are sort of stalking this girl. She's frightened. She's crying. This is really playing up on people's fears. The one on the right says, we'll protect your children. The second poster is particularly controversial because of what they are doing with their arms. Perhaps a nonverbal cue or a nod to something more sinister. What they're doing is not exactly the Nazi salute, but it's not either. It's ambiguous. Is that intentional? And everyone in the poster is what I would call, pretty Aryan looking. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. But if your party is already accused of being sympathetic to the Nazi past, and you genuinely want to move away from that association, which the AFD says it does, that it is not fascist, it is not neo-Nazi, would you make a poster like this? So then you can add into this already toxic atmosphere, as if there isn't enough already, the fact that anti-Semitic threats and violence have continued to rise, especially after the Hamas attack on Israel and the war in Gaza began. For example, according to the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency, Austria and Sweden saw anti-Semitic incidents increase by more than 400% in October to December of last year, compared to the same period in 2022. In addition, in 2022, Denmark reported only 9 anti-Semitic incidences, but this increased to 121 last year. So even though there haven't recently been the more spectacular attacks of past years, the security situation in many European countries is still quite unsettled, to say the least. Populist leaders like Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, and Geert Wilders, among others, feed off of people's fears and present themselves as strong leaders who will protect the people, They give them simple answers to what is really very complex problems. But this can be attractive to people who are looking for a sense of safety and stability and who don't believe that the government can or will provide it for them. So, to sum up, right-wing populist leaders and parties in Europe attract supporters because they rail against economic instability. They say that the elites are helping others to steal your jobs or to commit welfare fraud, or they're giving away all of your money to countries that can't pay their debts. They rail against cultural changes, immigration mostly, but also more liberal values like women's right to choose, gay marriage, and generally speaking, the move away from a Judeo-Christian toward a more secular society. As long as there are Europeans who are concerned about these three issues, right-wing populist parties will continue to have significant support. But to be clear, in many ways, this is not just a story about the rise of the far right. This is also about the collapse in popular support for the center, right, and left parties, who have traditionally held power over the past few decades, but who have been devastated in recent elections in many European countries. Populist parties have eaten into the center right, which has tried to compensate by adopting some of the policies of the far right, including becoming stricter about immigration and border issues. The Brookings Institute notes, for example, that during the 2017 Dutch election, center-right Prime Minister Mark Rutte castigated immigrants who don't want to adapt, quote, don't want to adapt, attacking our habits and are rejecting our values, who attack gay people, who shout out at women in short skirts or call ordinary Dutch people racist. Quote, his blunt message to them, act normal or go away. This was a center-right politician. Mark Rutte, by the way, is the newly appointed Secretary General of NATO. And I chose this editorial cartoon to sort of illustrate the point that the center-left and the center-right are sort of in free fall, and the far right has done a very good job of navigating in between them. This particular cartoon was referring to Sweden, but I think it definitely applies in many different countries in Europe. The center-left has done worse, actually, than even the center-right, in many cases suffering devastating electoral losses. This has left the center left-right dominance that has existed for decades in tatters. Much like in the United States, we have the Republican and the Democratic Party, the two sort of monolithic parties here. In general, in Europe, the center-left and center-right parties, which are called different things in different countries, but it's the same idea. They too, since the end of the Second World War, have really dominated the government and dominated leadership. These extremist parties can exist, but they haven't been able to really get into leadership, into the government. But that's changing because people feel like the center-left and center-right, they've been around forever. They're huge bureaucracies. They're not listening to people. And, they're just a bunch of elitists hanging out in Paris or Berlin that don't really understand people's problems. And so in addition to the far right gaining, it's also a matter of the center left and center right sort of collapsing, that people's support for them just is gone. They're just sick and tired of them. These parties have ossified over time, and they haven't done enough to address the societal problems brought on by repeating waves of cultural change, economic volatility, and security issues. This fecklessness has contributed to the rise of the far right and of the far left, in fact. There are a number of far left parties that are very active and popular in Europe as well. And this has allowed the far right to move closer and closer to the mainstream. Psychologically speaking, people have a fundamental need to feel respected and to feel heard. If they don't think that the traditional center parties are listening, they will look for alternatives. And I'll end here with a quote from a French journalist named Edouard Louis, who wrote in the New York Times about why his father voted for, at the time, the National Front, because I think it's a very good distillation of this sentiment. He said, "What those elections really meant for my father," this was in 2017, "was a chance to fight this sense of invisibility. My father understood, long before I did, that in the minds of the bourgeoisie, our existence didn't count and wasn't real. In the absence of any attempt by the left to discuss his suffering, my father latched onto the false explanations offered by the far right. Voting for him was a desperate attempt to exist in the eyes of others." And with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was great. Sorry, I was clicking buttons. I apparently can't do two things at once. Thank you. I appreciate your presentation. That was fantastic. I have a question for you. I'm wondering where climate change stands in all of this, and I know that I think my impression is that the far right is generally they're climate change deniers, but is that true across the board, or is that just in
Well,
pockets?
yeah, climate change is not real popular on the far right. It's one of those sort of elitist concerns that, the real people who have to live day to day, don't have the luxury of, worrying about that type of thing. So, yeah, definitely, it's not a right wing. And in fact, I mentioned in the Netherlands, it's part of their party plank that they, want to get rid of environmental regulations. That said, they do sometimes take on other things that sort of would surprise us from an American point of view. Many of the right wing parties are very strong on social programs, for example. Whereas here in the United States, we think the far right is always trying to cut welfare. But in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, and also in France, there's a very strong push by the far right they're always saying they're for the traditional family, and they're pushing for, money and allowances, giving money to people who have so many children, or, parental help of different types. So in an odd way, they are for social programs that we might, approve of as well. But yeah, climate change is not generally speaking one of their big platforms.
Hmm. So sorry, I have to cough.
It's
I'm
okay.
not sure how I do that on Zoom. I'm going to try and hold it in. I just want to remind people that um, if they have a question, you can do so in the chat, and that will come to me, and I will direct it to Andrea. Or you can raise your hand. You do that by uh, uh, hovering over the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, and you'll be able to raise your hand, and I'll be able to direct you'll be able to, wow, I'm starting to lose it. You'll be able to voice your question.
Go ahead and
We
cough.
do we do have a question in the chat. How do right-wing groups feel about NATO? Did you get that?
Yeah.
How do they feel about NATO?
Yeah, not a big fan of the generally speaking, not a big fan of the any organizational form that goes beyond their national borders. Like they're very Eurosceptical. They don't like the European Union. For many years, many of them actively wanted to get their countries out of the European Union. But then after Brexit happened, everyone saw what a complete mess that was. And then they decided, all right, well, we won't leave the European Union. We'll just try to reform it from within. And I think that the attitude toward NATO is very similar. Most of the most of the right-wing parties in Europe are, Russian sympathetic, in fact. Vladimir Putin, very shrewdly, in his effort to create chaos in Europe, secretly funds some of these right-wing parties. And Marine Le Pen actually got into some trouble for taking out loans in Russian banks, but her attitude was, well, the French banks won't give me any money, so I go where I can get it. Vladimir Putin is very interested in supporting right-wing parties in Europe. And so they are, generally speaking, I think, very skeptical of NATO, because they have Russian. That is not true, however, interestingly, of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She is actually a supporter of NATO and of Ukraine, which is unusual, because most of them, like I said, support Russia. Can't hear you.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
I apologize. So I may or may not have heard your answer, and you may have covered this with your answer. So I apologize. V is asking, following up on the question about NATO, what do right parties in Europe think about the threat from Russia? Did you cover that?
I
with your
did.
answer?
Well,
Okay.
basically, just that they're very, sympathetic to Russia. They don't think that they don't support Ukraine. Russia has funded some of these groups. That Vladimir Putin is, just interested in creating general chaos in Europe and doing anything he can do to, get people fighting with each other. So he has supported a number of these right-wing groups, and they are sort of Russia sympathetic.
Thank you. Eva, would you like to unmute yourself and go for it?
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for the presentation. Good to see you. So I am wondering about the economic implication, because as probably we all know, last month Mario Draghi came up with this report, which sort of addressed the urgent situation in European Union, lacking all the investment into technology and leaving Europe beyond US and China. And I think that's probably also one of the reasons people are, and then you have covered that in your presentation, but some of that I'm born, I'm Czech by birth, and I know this is a big part of the Czech political situation, that people just are, there's sort of like a malaise in a society. People are depressed because they are having basically the same salaries, and in 2008 there's no raise, and they don't see any outcome with the regular parties. So that's why they are really listening to those parties. It's similar like in this country, which promise them that if they're gonna get in power, their economic situation will be different. So I think it's a big part in Europe also, the economic situation, which Mario Draghi pointed out.
I also think it's a matter of people, not just their own personal economic situation, but it's one of those situations where people say, my children are not necessarily going to be better off than I am, and it's not only am I not doing well, it's not looking good for my kids. And so that's something that is a really psychological, makes people afraid too, when they think, I want my children to have, be able to have a nice life. And if the economic situation is so bad that it looks like that's not happening, that's frightening to people.
Mm-hmm.
Pushes
them I agree. Yeah.
Extremist parties sometimes.
Thank you, Eva, for that. Janny is asking, she says, Andrea, you did not mention European colonialism in the context of migration. At the same time, how does historical ongoing migration into certain Western European countries for economic reasons feed into far-right populism?
Well, of course, there's a long history of European colonialism in the Middle East and Africa. And so, yes, that certainly plays a role. It plays a role in which countries migrants who are coming up tend to go to. And it's, it's a long and complicated history and relationship between many European countries and their former colonies. And it's definitely something that, so for example, France occupied Algeria for a number of years. So many Algerians, when they migrate, will often come to France. And so there will be these large Algerian communities in France. In the Netherlands, it's Morocco. For whatever reason, there's a large Moroccan community in the Netherlands. And, sometimes the European countries have relationships and deals with these countries. We will take migrants from our former colonies, might have extra benefits for them. But it also is a matter of, people in European countries who are susceptible to the far right, see this as an outrage, that they shouldn't be giving people from Algeria, who come to France any extra privileges or anything like that. But it's definitely part of the whole history of migration, and it's a complicating factor in many ways. Yeah.
Susan, do you have your hand raised? Would you like to ask a question? We need you to unmute. Susan, hello? Okay, I'm going to move on and yes, I'm going to lower your hand, Susan, and if you want to speak again, you can give it a whirl. Let's see. Is inequality in Europe similar to the US?
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of parallels there. It's never an equal comparison, so to speak. But there are definitely inequalities in European society in the ways there are here. The working class suffers in much the same way in Europe as it does in the United States economically, with the Great Recession hit working middle class people in the United States and Europe very, very hard in very similar ways. Women struggle in Europe often. It's different. It's different, but there are certainly gender equality issues in Europe as well. So yeah, I think it is similar.
And I have one more question. From Wayne. Is Labour's strong showing in the recent UK elections an exception to the trend you have summarized? Far-right populists exist in UK, but after Brexit seem to have faltered.
Yeah, I think so. I think that in the UK, the Tories just did such a horrible job. Just Boris Johnson and people like that. People just got so fed up with them that I don't know that Keir Starmer was any great wonderful, savior coming in. I think that the Tories just messed it up so badly that people just said, "Oh, we're going to give Labour a chance." The whole situation with Brexit was just sort of incredibly difficult. It was a very divisive vote. After the vote, it was found that many of the promises made by the Brexiteers weren't actually true. It wasn't going to be the sort of Eden Nirvana situation that they had promised. And there have been a lot of problems in the UK since Brexit has happened. And so people were very disillusioned by that, I think. And I personally think it was just a matter of time before the Conservatives, the Tories got kicked out, and because Labour was in pretty bad shape not that long ago. I mean, they were very unpopular. So it's quite remarkable that they've made it back. The question is how long they will last before people get sick of them as well.
Jane asks, have there been a lot of difficulty forming coalition governments? And has there been moderating policies of the far right?
Have the coalitions moderated the far right? I mean, yeah, anytime you have to be in power with someone else, you have to be able to compromise. And as with many right-wing parties, and actually with extreme left-wing parties, they generally are better in opposition than they are in power, because once you're in power, you're actually responsible for doing things. And in Europe, if you have to form a coalition, you have to compromise. And that's, not something that is easy for them to do. The other thing that happens is that coalitions form against them. I think I mentioned it in my talk, but very often, even if a right-wing party does very well, it has to form a coalition, and other groups are like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And they will band together to keep the extremist party out of power. So I think it's a bane of their existence, the whole need to be in coalition. They would rather just rule by themselves.
I'm going to ask one last question from Peter before we wrap up. He would like you to talk about what happened in France's last election.
So the French have 2 rounds in their elections. You finish with the 2 top vote getters go into a runoff round, and Marine Le Pen, for the second time, was able to do that, was able to get into the second round, she and Emmanuel Macron. And the other parties said, we can't stand Emmanuel Macron, but we are going to band together, hold our noses, and encourage our voters to vote for him, because Marine Le Pen cannot be president of France. And so that's basically what happened to her.
Even though Macron is emblematic of the elite, as Peter points out.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. He's,
yep.
He's kind of a centrist, but he's just seen as incredibly out of touch. He's, there was a movement, and I think it may still be going on from time to time, called the Gilets jaunes protests, where people with bright yellow vests would go out on the streets and protest, originally about a gas tax, but they were just hating on Macron because he just wasn't understanding that the people in outside of Paris couldn't pay for gas taxes, and people in Paris don't even drive, they don't understand, they live in a bubble. And so yeah, he's very, very unpopular right now. But his term isn't up until, I think, 2027. So he should be around till then.
Well, I think that sums up our questions. So
Excellent.
I want to thank you very much for your talk this evening. It was very informative, and as you can tell, people were very engaged and interested in your topic. So thank you. I know you were, sometimes you throw these things out there and say, is anybody going to show up? So
Exactly.
So, well done. Thank you. And I want to also thank our my partner libraries, Scarborough Public Library and Falmouth Memorial Library, for partnering with me on this. And Pam, thank you for giving us the rundown of the Camden Conference. I'd like to remind everybody that the Camden Conference is happening on February 21st to 23rd. And you can find out more information about that and more information about other speaker events related to the topic of democracy under threat. You can find that at camdenconference.org. With that, I'm going to say good night to you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.